For a scarf, gauge isn't really important, but you probably want to crank a sample swatch to make sure the drape will flow like you want and to calculate how many rows you'll want to crank for the scarf or cowl to be the desired length. We're going to start with our setup bonnet. You hang every other ring, and I go all the way around all of the open needles that I can reach. If you don't have a setup bonnet, then you can use just a tube of scrap knitting, and there's another video on our YouTube channel for how to do that. So there I've hung all of them that I can reach easily. Now I'm going to crank my handle so that the first needle that has a split ring on it is right at the break in the yarn feeder. Then I'm going to load my project yarn into my yarn feeder. So this time we're not casting on with waste yarn. When we're knitting a swatch, you don't have to do the waste yarn step. You can just cast on directly with the yarn that you're measuring. And then, so I've dropped my yarn down in, I fed it through the yarn feeder. I'm adding my medium weight. I'm going to crank the first few to make sure they start catching. They did. And then I'll stop and hang the rest of the rings. There we go. And that was it. You go around one time, make sure they caught. Mine did. So now this is the time when you want to adjust the tension, and it's by far the easiest to start with looser tension and work tighter than the other way around. For a scarf, you probably want looser tension so the tube will be wider, and the most important thing is just that the tension is comfortable for knitting on the machine. For that, I suggest setting the cams around the 3rd mark or a little lower. Thought it might be helpful to show you what I meant by that. So this top of the bar is set right at the 3rd mark from the top, and I try to make it as even as possible, and then both of these knobs I make sure are really tight so it doesn't move while I'm cranking. So I'm going to crank a few rows and just see how the tension looks, if it looks too loose, if it looks too tight. Another thing to check is that the back of the stitches are just coming off the back of the cylinder. For sure, make sure that your stitches are not riding up on the needles. That means that your tension is too tight. So if you wanted to adjust the tension, you could go ahead and do that now and then crank a few rows. Make sure you're happy with it. Once you are happy with the tension and how it just looks on the machine to your eye, then turn on your row counter, reset it, and crank 50 rows. There I am at 50 rows, so I'm going to unthread my yarn, just let it fall in the center, and then hold at the bottom while I crank to remove my swatch. And then you can go ahead and drop out your soft weight. With a scarf, the most important thing is just whether you like the drape, whether you like the way it looks, whether it feels like it will be the right amount of flowy for you, whether you're happy with the width. And if it is, then we can measure rows per inch, which can help you calculate how many rows to crank to get the length of the scarf or cowl that you'd like to have. Or the other option is you can just crank until you're near the end of the yarn you'd plan to use for the project, maybe saving enough yarn for the final cuff if that's what you're doing with your scarf. If this is not right for you, if it's either too loose or too tight, you would need to rewind this swatch, cast on again, adjust your tension, or even adjust your cylinder size if it's off quite a bit, crank another swatch, and keep trying until you get it the width that you want. Okay, so that step's critical. There's no reason to go on until you get the width the way that you want it to be. After we know the width of the swatch is how we want it, the next step is to measure the number of rows per inch. And a good way to do that is to start by putting a pin. Again, we want kind of near the top because you want good rows. And I try to mark it so that there's a stitch that's, you're not splitting a stitch. You're clear where the first stitch is going to be. And then you lay your ruler on and you want 3 inches. Make sure that your ruler is lined up with a row of stitches. So it's not like this, cutting across the column of stitches. Make sure that the ruler is lined up exactly with your column of stitches. So I'm going to measure over to 3 inches and then mark where that is. Okay. Now, I like to use my loom tool then to count along with me, and I'm going to count how many stitches are in between the 2 needles. I came up with 32.5 stitches between the marks, and actually then I would normally count again. Once you know how many rows it is for 3 inches, then you divide that by 3, and that gives you your rows per inch. So if we want, we can do just a basic calculation for how many rows to crank for the scarf. So when I counted my rows in my 3-inch swatch, I came up with 32.5. And then I need to divide that by 3 to get my total number of rows per inch, and that is 10.8. Now let's say I want my scarf to be 70 inches long, then I would take 70 inches times 10.8 rows per inch is 756 rows. Now I need to subtract a total of 30 rows from the cuffs, so that gives me 726. And I would actually crank 726 rows for the main section of the scarf in order to end up with a scarf that's 70 inches. Once you're done with your measurements, you can remove the pins and then put your yarn back on your yarn winder and wind it up to start your project. Visit us at deanandbean.com and please like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.